Thank you so much for being here, especially if you heard our last panel. We just gave another panel, and if you're here again, thank you, thank you, thank you. It means that hopefully we did okay and you're not tired of hearing from us yet. So in this panel, I'm really excited to explore the experiences of those who joined a group and those who were born and raised in a cultic environment. We're specifically looking at SGAs and MGAs. And if you don't know what that means, that's okay. We'll define that here in a moment. But we thought that a panel would be really good on this sort of presentation because we're going to be looking at different perspectives and experiences of group involvement. When it comes to these categories, I really like to hear different perspectives on it. So first off, and this is kind of where we're heading, I wanted to mention our dear friend and colleague, Lisa Kohn, was not able to make it in person today. She's been having some health issues. She's amazing and what she still wanted to contribute. She has a video at the end that I will play. She pre-recorded her part of the presentation, so we'll wait for the end for that. But I so appreciate her. Lisa, I'm sure you're listening to this. I so appreciate you for taking the time to help out this panel and add your story and your voice to this. So thank you. I wanted to start off by introducing ourselves so you know a little bit about our stories, and we forgot to do that with the last panel. We just kind of jumped right in. So my name is Ashlen Hilliard. Hello. I'm a cult intervention specialist with my LLC called People Leave Cults. These are my mentors next to me, Joseph Kelly and Patrick Ryan. They've been working with families who have loved ones in extremist groups for over 40 years, which is amazing, amazing. Pretty hard to imagine. I know, because you're only 40. That's exactly right. So that's a little bit about my background. When I left my cultic group, I began in the field helping women and children and young men who were fleeing polygamous organizations out west. I worked really seriously in sort of the trenches, in sort of the first responder mode of getting people safety, food access, jobs, education. And it taught me a lot about different people's experiences, and especially amongst those in polygamous groups, usually are born and raised. There are a few who do convert in, but for the most part, it's a born and raised experience. So I have a lot of experience with women from communities in which they are born and raised in groups. After that, I went on to work for the International Cultic Studies Association. I worked for ICSA actually for 3.5 years. I used to be the person running these conferences. It's a little fun not to this year, to just relax and present. But the new executive director and the president and all those who are doing hard work are doing amazing things this conference. So thanks to them. I'm going to pass it over now to Pat and Joe.
Yeah, I'm Joe Kelly. I spent 14.5 years in 2 different Eastern groups. I left all that in 1990 and began to work with families and individuals who were involved in destructive groups. At that time, so it's actually not 40 years, it's 30 something, but close enough. I studied comparative religions. That led to my interest in exploring how best to help others who've been through similar circumstances as I had. On to Pat.
So I'm Pat Ryan. I have been doing this for 40 years. My first intervention was in 1983 in March, so we just passed my 40th year. I got involved in the transcendental meditation movement when I was 16, sort of 16, 17 on the edge. And I'm interested in this subject of SGA, MGA, and these boundaries between where people join and leave. To me, they're not so clear. I know that people will have a very different opinion, and then that's what we hope to flesh out.
And real quickly, Lisa Kohn. Lisa is an executive coach, and you may have heard of Lisa's book that was published maybe a few years ago To the Moon and Back, a childhood under the influence. She was someone who was raised in the Unification Church. She had a very interesting experience, and she will share more about that at the very end. So ultimately about this talk, our objective is to really critically examine these different categories of former members. I remember my first conference at ICSA, and I had no idea what an MGA or an SGA meant. It was total confusion, and I had to like ask like the organizers, what does this mean? And even then when they said, oh, it's if you're born or raised, and I'm thinking, well, I guess I was, but like, I'm also like multi-gen. And so it was very confusing. And I've had people come up to me when I worked at ICSA and said, you know, I wasn't like born and raised in a group, but my parents were in a group and left. And I was born and raised while they were still deconstructing their group influence. So it's almost like by proxy, in a sense, they were born and raised still with the cultic thinking to some effect. So it's a very interesting thing, these categories. So amidst sort of the nuances of individual experience, how can these categories, and ultimately our question, how can they be helpful? Because I think that they have a lot of value. And also, where do they lack clarity? And so I'm really interested to hear from you all. I really want this to be like a critical discussion of how maybe these categorizations have helped you, but also where did they lack distinction, clarity? Are there things that we can improve upon when it comes to these labels? And so these are just some things that we want to explore today. As I already mentioned, we have sort of an array of representation. Lisa was raised in the Unification Church. She is an SGA, a second generation former member. Pat and Joe, they are both first generation former members based on these categories. They joined later in life. And I am considered an MGA, a multi-generational adult former cult member. I'm someone who was born and raised in a group. On my mother's side was born and raised in a group, and on her mother's side, I probably go back 3 or 4 generations. So the systemic influence within my family is very, very strong. So we kind of hope to have with our panel today an array of backgrounds so we can sort of discuss all these different categories. So when it comes to this sort of outline and where we're going, we're just going to real quickly define what these terms mean. What does the research say on these categories of former members? And also we want to share our experiences and how they fit into those categories, and maybe how do they not so much fit within those categories. And this is where towards the, in a little bit here, I would love to hear people share their experiences if you feel comfortable. I should say that this is being live streamed. You do not have to mention your name. If you'd like to participate, you can mention as little or as much as you would like to about your story, and I will bring you the microphone when we hit to that segment today. So I have up here sort of more fleshed out definitions when it comes to FGAs, SGAs, and MGAs. So again, an FGA is a first generational adult former member. An FGA joined a group independent of their family or their family's influence. When it comes to SGAs, those are second generation adult, and a term used to describe those who are born or raised. And MGAs, like I had just mentioned, are multi-generational adult former members whose parents were born or raised in a group, or whose family involvement may go back many, many generations. So Dr. Jill Abby Minton, she's actually here at this conference. She has done amazing research, and she's actually the one who coined the term MGA. She introduced this third category of multi-generational adult leavers. And this emerged during her doctoral research on qualitative research on former members of the exclusive Brethren community, a group in which she was born and raised in, multi-gen, and subsequently left. I think it's important to distinct from FGAs at least, SGAs and MGAs never joined a high control group. they were born in that sort of sense. And again, I'm speaking to the ways in which these categories are defined currently. So we can sort of critique some of these things later on, but these are sort of the introductions into some of these categories and issues. At this time, I want to, before I get into the research on SGAs and recovery, I'm hoping to get more of a historical perspective from these two here. When it comes to FGAs, SGAs, MGAs, and how it emerged in the sort of ICSA sphere, the timeline, I would like to hear about the different workshops, how those things went, what were some of the growing pains of that, and so on. So who would like to start?
So many years ago, last night we had a tribute to Carol Giambalvo. Okay, Carol Giambalvo, who was the person who helped develop a lot of these workshops that existed. And Carol is the one who began pushing this concept that there is different needs for people who are born and raised, and created what I feel is an exclusivity in terms of membership in one of these categories. As a person who, in theory, is a first generation adult, I was not permitted to attend any of these SGA workshops. So even though I've been in this field for 40 years, the knowledge that is shared in those environments is not shared with someone like me. And I find that frustrating. In a similar way, the concept of cult in the past, there are people who don't like that particular concept, and they were not allowed to attend former member workshops. And so they found this mysterious thing that what happens inside these workshops. So at some point, Joe and I were in Madrid at the University of Madrid, and we were doing some workshops for former members, and we had allowed in one session people who are sociologists of religion to come to a particular session. And we asked in that session about the term cult, and this is very similar to asking these questions about SGA and MGA. And the question I asked to start the session was, is the term cult necessary to describe your experience, or is it what Dr. Lifton would call a thought-terminating cliche? So is that term something that's helps or not helps? And the room in Madrid divided into three camps. And there was those people who had recently left their groups, and they found that term as a cult as something they coalesced around, and it was highly meaningful. And there were people who were out for 30 years, and they didn't find that term as useful. But from that point on, a number of the sociologists of religion, some people may call them cult apologists, began using the term cult and found it had meaning. So because they were allowed to experience this. In the ICSA context, the SGA workshops have been cordoned off to people like myself, so we don't have that level of experience working with people. And so that's sort of the context that we come from.
I just wanted to add real quickly, while it excluded people like Pat from sort of gaining insight into MGAs, I also understand why it was structured that way. In that MGAs need a safe place to be able to discuss with their peers who are also MGAs. It provided a sense of belonging. But yes, it did. It had pros and cons, you see, and this is where we hope to get into some of the critical nature of this. But yeah, people, professionals in the field were really sort of kept out of these meetings. They were very exclusive in nature. And that was a good thing, but also maybe a not so good thing. Joe, anything to add?
Yeah, I think that when we look at group influence, we see that those second gen and multi-gen have experienced many of the same things first generation experience. So the benefits of being in the larger group are that you'll be able to share information that you all experience as common, as opposed to only looking at certain traits that exist within the second gen community. I think there are benefits to be gained from communicating those experiences with first, second, and multi-gen all together. And when you only have tracks devoted to second gen, it isolates them, and maybe some of the the healing that can take place and being in the room with those who joined of their own accord, but then, you know, the first gen can say, well, we didn't join a cult, we joined a church, an organization, a spiritual path, a multi-level marketing program. So these things can, you know, will respond better to an open forum, I think.
I think when it comes to cult survivors and survivors of high demand group, if you prefer, you know, that terminology, we have more in common than we think, no matter our experience, no matter the diversity of our backgrounds. And I think that can also be true within those who are born and raised and those who are first gen. We find similarities. It's sometimes within the differences where we get sort of the furthest amounts of understanding. So it's just, thank you for mentioning that, because I think it's a really important point. So when it comes to research and what we know on SGAs and recovery, a small research study was commissioned to evaluate the complex issues facing those raised in high demand groups and their families. And one sweeping conclusion of this was a particular ICSA study was that most SGAs leave their group in a state of confusion, and they need to sort out what you see on your screen, numbers 1 through 5. Number 1, why their parents joined and left, if their parents did leave, that is, the group. Number 2, how they even feel about the leader post-leaving. Number 3, how to evaluate whether abuse did occur. That one's actually huge. Number 4, who they are separate from the group. Jilly Jenkinson talks a lot about this, sort of the post-cult pseudo-identity. She's done some excellent work on that. And number 5, why they struggle with relationships. And when you look at this list, while this is in the context of SGAs, how many first generational adults also experience these items? You know, I feel like there's a lot that is across the board, perhaps very similar in our experiences. The source on this is Lessons Learned from SGAs and about recovery and resilience by Leona Fernari and Roseanne Henry. And I have a link to that if anyone's interested in looking at that study.
I'm going to say, these are my friends, Leona and Roseanne, and I think that their research is accurate for a universe of people that they sampled. So there's the universe of people that have been in groups. There's a universe of people who've been raised in groups. There's a universe of people who've left those groups. There's another universe of people who feel they've been harmed by that experience. Then there's another universe of people, which is smaller, that come to something like ICSA. And then there's another universe of people who the research is done on. So the research is accurate on that universe. It's not necessarily reflective of the entire experience. And I think that distinction should be made, because when we impose the research on this group of people, it doesn't necessarily ring true.
So being raised in a cultic group can impact seriously and impair a child's cognitive, social, emotional, moral, and basic life skill development. This is part of Dr. Jill Abby Mitten's research that she did on MGAs specifically. The title of her research was called "That's Not Me," an exploration of first generation, second generation, and multi-generational adult leavers. And again, I'd be happy to send this article along. Feel free to message me on the app. But again, when we look at some of these things, there's a lot of these listings when it comes to multi-generational adults that can also be very applicable to first gens and also second gens. So many of our experiences are shared. When it comes to cognitive, what Jill was sort of talking about in her paper was that children may have limited decision-making skills, ability to ask questions, and most importantly, the ability to think critically, which is huge. When it comes to social development, the child may or may not be comfortable making new friends or being in new social settings. Emotional development, the child may not know how to express feelings or even know how to name them. Moral values are often given by the group. So upon leaving, the child may not have a moral compass, so to speak. And when it comes to basic life skills, the child may not learn how to open a bank account, order a meal in a restaurant, write a CV, or go in for an interview, not even knowing how to do some basic life skill tasks. And again, I think about those who are maybe first generation who join groups, maybe in their midlife or later in life. It's possible to be so sort of totalistically consumed by a group that maybe we need help with basic life skill development even after we've left. I think of Joe actually, and hopefully it's okay, I'm self-disclosing for you, but Joe spent so much time meditating that after he left his group, he lost for a short period of time the ability to read. And that's something that you had to sort of work towards and get back.
Yeah, the retraining aspect of, retraining your mind to be able to absorb information, because all the information that was encouraged was the uncritical, spaced out notion of gaining internal knowledge.
Yeah, I want to go back to these distinctions, and I really hope that people participate and give their feedback on this. So we were both raised in Irish Catholic families, living in Irish Catholic communities, that Catholic school, Catholic universities in Joe's case, that there were saints, that there were people on earth that could fly. There were some saints in the Catholic Church, so they had to be tied down so they wouldn't float away. So that kind of magical thinking was very integral to our lives. And I believe was the setup for believing that there's gurus on earth who are also perfect people. So the question that always I have is, how is that experience different than an SGA who was raised in another group? There was abuse within the Catholic Church. I was not sexually abused, but I was abused by nuns, shamed. And if we did something wrong, our siblings would be in trouble. So if I was in first grade and I did something wrong, I would be dragged up to my sister's classroom and she would be in trouble because I did something wrong. So this odd discipline was taking place. And she, my youngest sister, learned how to read when she was 3. And so when the 8th graders, when she was in kindergarten, were struggling with reading, she was brought to the 8th grade class to embarrass the 8th graders that this 5-year-old could read and they couldn't. So this experience of being raised in that kind of Catholic environment is what I happen to struggle with. Whereas I'm labeled an SGA according to these criteria, but in many sense, I don't see it that way. I see it that I've had a whole lifetime of this. And so those categories are not as clean for me. And that's what I'm trying to understand.
Did you want to add anything?
Nope.
Okay. Yeah, it's kind of that question of, is Pat considered a SGA because of this sort of cultural religious influence in the environment? In a sense, it was kind of encompassing in that you were raised in a Catholic community, in a Catholic household. It's encompassing in that way, in many ways that sometimes cults can be, or certain ideologies. And so would you be considered, an SGA and then later a first gen for joining TM? There's so many layers to this. And that's kind of what we're hoping to critically examine and get your feedback on is these categories may not be as, I guess, distinct as there can be some overlap, and that's okay. That's a good thing. So when it comes to multi-generational adults and their experiences, what are the factors within the family system in particular that may impact an MGA's experience? While maybe being born and raised adhering to a particular ideological perspective. So for example, there can be all these different factors within the context of MGAs. When you think about MGAs, parents can serve as gatekeepers to doctrines and practices of the cultic group. They're passed on to the children, and to what extent outside influences are allowed in. And that's a direct quote from Jill's research. We look at within the family system, for example, while ideological belief systems from a group that your family may be in may be portrayed a certain way across the group, within that particular family system, it can look very differently or maybe not be applied evenly across the different families involved. When it comes to, the role of the generational history of the family unit, it's crucial when examining the MGA's experiences. This can be positive or negative. And this is referred to in Jill's research as narrative inheritance. Narrative inheritance. That was really hard for me to say for some reason. And I really like that term because this can sort of trickle down into the diverse experiences that children have within these family systems. So I just kind of want to give an example. I talked in the first panel, if you sat in, a little bit about my story and backstory. Being an MGA myself, third or fourth gen, the influence of this particular group, this particular fundamentalist Christian sect, was really, carried on through narrative inheritance. And what was so crucial to my family's narrative, to my family's, willingness to commit to this particular ideology and group was facilitated through attending a particular college, which I mentioned in the first panel. That attending this particular college was a way of truly sort of carrying down the legacy that I would have within this group, and that my mom before me and my grandmother before me had within this group. So this sort of notion of narrative inheritance is really interesting when we're born and raised in high control groups. When we sit around with our parents or grandparents and we talk about our family's history, so much of it for MGAs can really be centered upon the church, the church or the particular spiritual group. And it's kind of a unique thing because when you visit a family who is maybe not in a high control group or a high control situation, you hear them exchange family stories. You hear them exchange all kinds of things. And it's not to say that my family didn't exchange family stories, but it was so sort of the focal point of all of this was the group throughout the generations. And that left a pretty large systemic impact on me. And I think about, when I left, in that I departed from generations of this particular belief system, and that was a very hard thing. When you think about too, I wanted to mention siblings, the siblings experience within the family. I have one younger brother. He's everything to me. I adore him. He had a very different experience than I did within the group. And a lot of that had to do with our age. I grew up in a military family. I was sort of that military brat, as people put the joke to and label on. And we moved every 4 years across the country. And because of that, I got to see a lot of different churches within this particular sect. I get to really get a gist of sort of different ways that churches functioned, how they were textbook similar, how they weren't. And my brother and I actually attended the college, in which was so important in my family's legacy in the group. And my brother didn't have that experience. It was a very different one. He went to a university, a large school. I was very excited for him, actually. I tried to live vicariously through him for a short period of time. And we just had totally different experiences. He didn't experience the sort of same intensity, indoctrination, the things that I experienced while in that college. And so he has a hard time being as critical about the group as maybe I was, and that's okay. And so there's, even amongst siblings and family structures, what I'm trying to say is we have very different experiences, even though we're raised in the same system. So there's a quote that I really liked that Jill gave. It says, "To begin with, the range of discourses available is limited. The children are raised not to question. Critical discourse is not permitted, and the idea of change is not on the agenda." And I know for many SGAs or MGAs in the room, that was probably true. We did what we were supposed to do from the time we were born. We didn't really see any other option, even if we weren't necessarily bought in. So I like to tell people I wasn't really bought in from a young age about my particular group, but that's what it was. You know, we attended, and this was when we attended, and that was my life. I didn't really have a chance to think about other options until I was in my young adult years. So Jill talked a lot about learning is not encouraged, and questions raised receive inadequate answers or are dismissed. Sometimes dissent is not tolerated, activities are restricted, love is experienced as conditional, and fear, threat, and guilt are present. And I think that's some pretty powerful language to describe the experience of those born into these systems. And we think about sort of the ramifications of that. We think about the effect on children if families change their views over time, or key differences and factors about reintegration into society. I think about my experience as an MGA, and maybe those of you in the room have similar experiences. The way in which I was parented and raised was kind of different, really different actually, than how my parents are now. You know, they're still members, and they probably will continue to be members, but they've really loosened up, so to speak, since getting sort of the children over the finish line into young adulthood. And I wonder, and I'd love to hear if that was maybe the case with some of your families. It's not always. Sometimes as the children get older, or if they leave the church, it may make the parents more intense, you know, and into their belief system. But sometimes parents, even within these systems, have a lot of flexibility over time. Sometimes it could be because they moved, geographically speaking, they attended a different church, they have a different set of friends, community. Sometimes I know with parents in high control groups, they want to really put on this strong spiritual front until their children are off on their own. That may continue, you know, even when you're in school and communications with them, but especially in the child rearing years, it can be especially intense. Mean that that's how the family will always operate or be. And so I kind of enjoy sort of the nuances of these discussions. So that's a little bit about my experience. I was wondering if you two have anything to add or would like to share before I play Lisa's video.
I have a question for you, Ashlen. As a multi-gen former member, what do you think we get right as first Gen X members, and where do you think we're missing a piece of the education puzzle?
That's a really good question. Well, like I mentioned before, I think we have more in common than not. But I also think about those who are maybe, again, I think about the children. I think about children and the effects that this could have on them. And I think when it comes to first generation versus multi-generation, you know, when I was born and raised in a group, if I decide to have children at some point in my life, I would really want to make sure that I'm like, you know, I see myself as pretty detached now from the group beliefs and the group think, but I would really want to make sure that I don't sort of this theory of transference onto those children, so that I don't raise them in a system that is like this, where parents serve as the gatekeepers, so to speak, to doctrines and practices. And I think first generational adults, to sort of answer your questions, they join a cult, you know, later in life. They may be in a cult for however long, and then they leave. And maybe once they left, they see that as sort of the separation point. But I think that sort of, I guess, the power of transference could still be transferred down generationally, even if you are a first generation member. And I don't feel like that I see that talked about a lot for those. Are you guys with me? Does that kind of make sense? When you join a group and you leave for first gen, that's sort of the end of that experience. But we actually adopt a lot of theories, beliefs, and practices within the groups that can still trickle down generationally. I hope that makes sense. So that's, was that helpful? Yeah. Yeah, so now actually is the time I would really, really love some discussion. Right at the top of the hour, right at 5, we're going to play Lisa Cohen's video. And she's going to round us out towards the end here. But I wanted to get you all's involvement in what you think about these categories, your experiences. Do they fit? Do they not? Criticisms, applauses towards the categories. I'm open for it all. And so if you don't mind raising your hand, if you would like to ask a question, I will bring you a microphone. Thank you.
Hi, so many thoughts. Um, I will try not to hog the microphone. I was born and raised in the International Churches of Christ, which was a sect that came off of the mainline, or what was the word that you used? Non-institutional. Yeah. I'm not sure what my parents and my grandparents were, but yeah, so a sect of a sect of a sect of a sect. I think for me, something that I've noticed with first generation, right, difference in my experience and being born and raised in a group is I had some pretty serious psychological trauma when at 12 I found out about my group. And I kind of I've explained it sometimes as sort of like not really leaving the womb. I don't know how to describe it, but mentally I didn't have a life outside of the group. So when I found out that the group was not only not doing all these wonderful things that I thought that it was doing, but it was perpetuating harm to many, many people. Far more people were leaving the group than were staying in the group. I think it just like broke my brain a little bit. So I that's a psychological experience. I think that is hard to even explain, that I think that is unique to when you're born and raised in the group. And if you're familiar with schemas, I talked about this in my talk earlier, but in social psychology, I learned about schemas. You know, you learn, it's like a web, right? You learn certain things over time as a child, and you're talking about being a child. That's what it is. That's the difference, I think, is that if you're so indoctrinated in the group, and it depends on, I guess, how deep you are in the group, but I was very deep. My parents were a part of the Boston movement and moved up to Boston. So for me, it was like I had an existential crisis at 12. So I just wanted to mention that as being, I think, a unique thing. And to your point about people loosening up, I think it is natural as people get older to sort of reevaluate their priorities. I noticed that my grandfather was a Church of Christ minister his entire life. But maybe you did, Raleigh Wooten. And he passed away a couple of years ago. But towards the end of his life, I would say the last 5 or 10 years, he just did lots of things that I don't think he would have done in his normal ministry. He would go to Panera Bread and take all the leftover food and drive it down to a homeless shelter. He spent a lot of time driving people to doctor's appointments, a lot of things that I think, I don't know, maybe it's because he's older too, but I do think it was because he also had the perspective of what impact he was making, right? So also in my experience of my parents, they did loosen up a lot, and I think I've seen a lot of Church of Christ and International Churches of Christ parents, I guess boomer generation, loosen up a lot because they've seen how harmful the theology and the system has been towards their kids. And so many people I know are just struggling my age. And one more thing I'll say about siblings is something and I have 3 kids, so I see this even now, is that every sibling has a different parent. And I think, and that's truly my experience with my brothers. One of them has been out of the ICOC for a very long time, longer than I have. And he still struggles with PTSD and a lot of things. And one of them is still in the ICOC. And then there's me. And so, yeah, those are all my thoughts.
Are you a helping professional, mental health professional?
I'm in school right now. I'm an undergraduate, but I'm considering studying adolescent psychology, and identity, social identity development.
So it's interesting. I've done a lot of Boston movement cases over my years, and I'm just wondering about your experience of other families within the Boston movement. Were they as strict as your family might have been? There
There
more-
was, yeah, there was definitely a spectrum. Definitely if you were a pastor's kid, or someone that the church relied on in an important way, right? Whether you were wealthy, so the church, that kind of thing. There was definitely a class element to all that. But yeah, there were families that were more strict than mine. I wouldn't even say mine was very, it's interesting. I think we were strict in, not strict in a lot of the ways you would think of as in with fundamentalism, the Gothards, that kind of thing. We weren't like, I don't know, wearing long clothes, and there was some of that purity culture stuff, but the family was viewed on this pedestal, like family, like closeness to the family, and coveting, like having this nuclear, family view, right? And that being this ideal. And I'm sure you're familiar with Kathleen Jenkins' book, Awesome Families. So that kind of thing. And I think because of that idolization, there was a strong grip on what your kids did and didn't do, who they were and weren't with, and that kind of thing. We didn't ever have any family vacations. They were always tied to conferences for the church. And I never had an experience. I don't even remember going to friends' birthday parties, like from school, that kind of thing. We didn't have time for it because we were always at the church. And there was one more thing I was going to say, but I can't remember what it was. But
let me bring you the mic. I think there's a huge amount of shame that also gets transferred generationally. There was a pretty significant divorce, for example, that happened within my family that I was not told about until I was in college. And the reason for that, which was so devastating for me to hear, was because, the people who were in this particular relationship, they wanted to model what Christian parents looked like. And that was a divorce-free home. And it broke my heart to hear that they felt like they had to keep that from family members, that it was a secret. So I feel like when it comes to shame, sort of speaking to what you're experiencing, there's certainly a continuum.
Hi. I guess I consider myself to be an SGA. My parents got involved with the group when I was 8 years old, and I have a sister 3 years younger than myself. One of the things that I notice as being different for me as a second generation compared to my parents who actually chose to get involved with the group is that they came to it with some pre-existing knowledge and religious beliefs of their own. Whereas being raised in it from a young child all the way until I was 19, my belief system was the belief system of the group. And I didn't know anything really different. I mean, we attended some other churches when I was growing up, so I knew a little bit. And ours was considered, I guess, a quote unquote Christian cult. And as a result, I ended up thinking that everything that I was being taught through that group was Orthodox Christianity. This is what Christianity is really all about. And Of course, coming out of that, I realized, oh no, this is way off base and totally different. But I can remember my parents, and this is me when I was in my early 30s, is how long it took for me to realize I had actually grown up in a cult and didn't really know it, because my belief system had not been challenged until that point, and I reached a point of depression. And I remember going back to my parents and asking them some questions, like things that I knew that I had grown up believing. For example, sinless perfection. God expects us, if you're a Christian, that you won't sin anymore. And I said something to my parents about that. I said, do you believe in sinless perfection? And they laughed and said, no. And that was, I mean, I was like, what on earth are you talking about? How on earth could you not believe that when this is clearly what we were taught? And so that was startling to me. And things of that nature, just knowing that, you know, my parents had a set of beliefs that they kind of still hung on to and weren't able to, or didn't, maybe had a little more discernment just because they were adults and had this previous experience, that they were able to reject some of those beliefs. Whereas I was a little sponge and I just absorbed everything that I was taught as being absolute truth. And I'm just curious to know if other people have experienced that, and also what it is like for first generation. I mean, people who actually of their own volition joined the group. And have you seen that? Maybe if you're a parent with a child, have you seen that sort of thing come out?
It's kind of like I see in Catholicism. I was raised Catholic, 12 years of Catholic schooling. And as a child, I was very involved in the beliefs. I really loved the concept of living for Jesus. And, you know, the saints were emulating the ideals. And so when I got involved with a spiritual path, which was Hindu, I kind of transferred that kind of approach onto the Hindu path. So in some ways it was continuous, but it was broken by, you know, adolescent rebellion at some point, a little bit of, you know, that thing went on, and I got back on track. And when I did, and back on track in quotes, my experience of the movement that I got involved in, the TM movement, was a continuation of the mystical states that were promised within the more severe path of Catholicism. The saints that would, you know, get poked in the eye, and, you know, I idealized that. And TM said, you can achieve these states, but you don't have to get poked in the eye. So there was some continuity being first gen. I'm curious about your parents. Are they, did they break from the church? Are they still involved, or? Yeah.
He was able to say, like, but he wasn't, you know, and so my reaction to her was, I think he did the best that he could, given the knowledge he had at the time.
That's
Yeah.
beautiful. And I appreciate that, because when it comes to like closure, when you're born and raised in the system and you have parents who either maybe shun you for leaving the church, or maybe you're still in contact, but you don't feel like you can really talk to them about how you're feeling or what you've experienced or even the harms that were caused. And that's devastating to not feel like you can be authentic and honest with your family. I think that's really beautiful what you said. And I really believe that to be the case so often for families is that they do the best they can. We're all deceived. We all make choices. They probably got some positives out of it. It's a hard situation.
What you said spurred on an area that I think there would be an interesting area of research, and that is families of any kind of religion or system that converge. The parents are, I don't know, Baptist and they become Catholic when their children are 10. And so technically those people would have joined the church, their first generation, their kids would be second generation. So it'd be interesting to look at in terms of research, people who've joined even mainstream churches have a conversion at a different time, rather than the faith tradition that they were raised in or their family or origin.
Next question.
So, interestingly enough, this is an interesting topic for me because I am a fourth generation Jehovah's Witness, ex-Jehovah's Witness, and my husband is a first generation. So it's funny because what I've learned since I've been here is not to remind him of that. I just kind of wanted to share that because honestly, I think the big difference is, and obviously being married, we can share the differences, is I lost my childhood, he did not. And so my childhood was no Christmas, no birthdays. I celebrated my first birthday at 56. I left at 55 years old. So, my first Christmas was last year. I'm going to be 59. So that's the difference to me, because I think that you're right, that we share the same experiences while we are in. I 100% agree with that. But the fact that a first generation has something to go back to, I didn't have anything to go back to because I had all these generations above me. So I had no safe zone. My children are still in. So I lost everybody because they practice a shunning, obviously. So like I have nothing to fall back on. So I had no authenticity that I knew of. I didn't know who I had to ask myself. So I think with my husband being first generation, he can say, well, I knew who I was before. But again, I want to say that I appreciate this conference so much. And even this, because it made me realize that it's not a competition. And I didn't realize that I didn't really mean to feel that way, but I would keep saying, but you don't understand. I lost my childhood. And I feel like I'm going to be more careful when I say that, because I feel like first generation, he was in because I was in. So he wasn't hook, line, and sinker like I was, but he was in for 12, 13 years with me because I've been out 3. So yeah, so not a question, just kind of acknowledging that.
This is exactly why we want to have this.
That's what we wanted. Yeah. I think this is where the categorizations can be really helpful, is what you're speaking to. And I think these terms, FGA, SGA, MGA, can come across so binary. I'm all about not breaking the binary, so to speak. And I feel like sharing and being allowed to be in spaces with people with all kinds of experiences in this is a great sort of starting place. Like, thank you for sharing that. I totally agree with you. And when it comes to first generation, we work with parents who have children in cults, extremist groups. And our job is to help the parents maintain connection with their loved one, because sometimes when someone is a first generation, they make such horrible decisions, when they join a group. Sometimes the parents do write them off. And in that instance, they have nothing to fall back on. And so it's tough. It's tough. I have you, and then Dresden. Yeah. And then you.
Nuance is what we're looking for.
Yeah, we're looking for the nuances. Yes, for sure.
Hi, thank you. I'm really nervous talking about in groups, so pardon the shaking. This is such an interesting conversation. Thank you on so many levels. I'm not usually a fan of labels or categories, but I also understand the importance of naming a difference. And I understand the importance of understanding ourselves through certain categories. And so I think the complexity of this conversation can also go into like look into the place that a person is processing their experience, right? You two have obviously had a lot of childhood experiences that emulate SGA, MGA. I myself, I guess, am an SGA, I'm not sure. But I also happen to be non-binary. I also happen to categorize myself as transgender. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. And so categories in general are really interesting to me. I think that also in the grander context of the conversation of marginalization and erasure, I think these categories can be really helpful in people coming out and seeing themselves, oh, okay, that was my experience. Oh, I was born and raised in this. I think also in terms of psychological research and like social implications, like social development, somebody who was born and raised in the same environment as you were speaking to before, and not having an opportunity for critical thinking until later in life. I mean, we're still studying about the neurological effects of those kinds of things, those kinds of rearings, right? So I guess my sort of closing thought is, and totally happy to be argued with or having a different opinion. But I guess my closing thought is I really appreciate the context in which how can these categories be helpful and help us see ourselves, and then how can they also be used to cross differences and learn from each other. And I was particularly struck by the sort of experience of exclusivity that you shared in the beginning of this talk, and would love to see these categories be something that also is inclusive. Yeah.
Exclusivity is not in this field. The first conference I went to was in 1996. And the exclusivity in that one was, were you deprogrammed or not? So I had to go through almost at a registration desk at the Cultic Awareness Network, almost a purity test that I was out because this was, have you been deprogrammed or not deprogrammed? So there's I guess an irritation that remains with me around the categories.
Like in groups, and so my worry is this ultra binariness of these categories, and so I'm with you where categorization is helpful, and so that's why I'm like, let's like really dissect these stuff. Can I get a time check real quick?
Yeah.
I want to have time for, okay.
4:58.
Few questions, I'm so sorry, and then we're gonna have to play Lisa.
Yeah,
You want a mic?
I'll be brief.
Ashlen? Oh, you have the mic. Okay, I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah. Is it on? Yeah. My experience was similar to yours, where I was an adult before I realized that I was raised in a cult. I just thought it was kind of a weird church, and it didn't really appeal to me. So when I left for college, I just left. And I talked about this in my talk earlier today. I then got curious and started to look into it and found that now I was fourth generation Pentecostal. I grew up in the Assemblies of God. And when I looked into it, I found it was very clear historical record that the church emerged from a network of totalitarian cults here in the United States a little more than 100 years ago. And my initial thinking was, oh my God, I'm going to show this to my whole family, my parents who are ministers, and my uncles who are ministers, and my cousins who are lay leaders. And they're going to be like, oh my God, we were raised in this too, and we got to get out of here. And of course, it was the total opposite. It was, don't talk to us about this anymore. We're going to have to cut off communication with you. And this is purely hypothetical, but I suspect that if I were a second generation, if they had a life before they became indoctrinated and didn't themselves grow up in it and internalize the belief system so early in life, they wouldn't have heard with me saying these things to them. They wouldn't have interpreted it as being like, oh, my whole life has been a waste. You know, my dad's 70, you know, and here I am being like, everything you think from the day you were born is completely, you know, different. That's impossible to hear in most cases. So I feel like, and what that meant for me was I just couldn't get an audience among the people who I thought were the most important to hear what I had to share. And it was like banging my head against the wall for like months. It's very frustrating. So I feel like as an MGA, that it was probably something that is inherent to that category in a way that, you know, it may not be for like.
And do you feel it's more helpful to associate at these conferences with exclusively MGA, SGA people, as not exclusively associate, but to have special seminars just for your people who've been?
I think it would be, yeah. I mean, this is my first one, but yeah, I mean, it's very validating to hear other people having a similar experience. I'm not crazy, you know, that's like,
Yeah,
nice to hear.
These are very important questions that you asked.
I want to keep this going for like another hour. I wish we could. You know, on the Whova app, you can submit questions, feedbacks on this panel specifically, and I would love for you to, if anyone felt like adding a comment that we didn't get to. I put some poll questions up on this talk. Feel free to agree or disagree with the poll questions. Would love to have some input there. And we are going to now play, to end this session, Lisa Kohn's experience as an MGA. Did you have anything to add before I played that?
No, I
video?
was just wondering if potentially we could continue this type of discussion if people are interested in a Zoom meeting, maybe next week.
Yeah, so we're looking
anyone
at
would like-
planning. If anyone would like to continue this conversation on Whova, we can schedule a Zoom meetup post-conference, maybe in like a week. If anyone's interested in participating more. Okay, I'm getting some thumbs up, so that's great. Awesome. So be on the lookout for that on Whova. We'll organize a meetup. So we can just continue the conversation, because I think this is really important. And I know we're short on time. So thank you for sharing. I know it's hard to share.
so
It's scary to
much.
share. Thank you for sharing. Now we're going to listen to Lisa Kohn's portion of this presentation. And I'm so happy she was able to pre-record her portion.
We miss her.
And we miss her dearly. If you're listening, Lisa. Is it possible to hit the play button on the? Perfect. Thank you. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Lisa Kohn. I so wish I were there with you today, but where I am is not so bad either. I am a Unification Church / Mooney second gen, not born but raised, which I had a lot of shame about for years when I was in the church, but that's a whole nother story. And I'm thrilled to at least be able to share my story with you here today. My mom joined the Unification Church in 1974, took me and my brother with her. I left in the early 80s. It was a long, drawn out process. And honestly, I cold turkeyed it. I didn't even know there was a community like this until 2018, right before my memoir came out, when someone introduced me to EXA, and I went to the conference in Philly and my mind exploded. And so I am thrilled to be here today to share my experience with you in hopes that it helps any of you with your own path and journey. I'm actually going to read from the memoir because I think that's an easier way for me to kind of tell my story. And I hope to connect with some of you, any of you in any way, virtually, after any of this. So here we go. My brother says that we were raised by wolves. I don't always agree with him, but I don't have an accurate description of our upbringing. The friend of my dad's pointed out that wolves raise their young with more structure than our parents gave us. At first, I had no idea that anything was wrong with my childhood. My dad was a hippie bartender who convinced my brother to smoke pot at the age of 10 and who offered to sell me to his friends for drugs. He was kidding. I was running the household when I was 11, shopping, cooking, cleaning, because at that point, both my parents were gone. My brother and I left to fend for ourselves way more than you might say is optimal. And yeah, I grew up in a cult. My mom is a Mooney, and therefore, so are my brother and I. For those who don't know what that means, the Moonies were members of the Holy Spirit Association for the Unification of World Christianity, simply known as the Unification Church. the cult of all cults in the American age of cults. Church members gave their faith, lives, and worldly possessions to a self-proclaimed Messiah from South Korea. Some call it brainwashing. It was my life. I know it was weird, but I didn't know it was bad. When it's all you know, it's all you know. You haven't grasped that it could or should be different. I know I could tell stories about my parents and people would laugh in disbelief, but I was oblivious to the fact that my stories covered up pain and emotional scars, and that much of what happened to me shouldn't have happened at all. I didn't realize I was harmed. I thought I was on a path of harming myself as I got older. I ended up in abusive relationships, anorexia, and mild drug addiction, to name a few things. I didn't register that these are because I ached so much inside. I didn't know that my psyche was bruised or that I despised myself. As a kid, you misinterpret the nasty things that happen to and around you, and you somehow believe you're to blame. As a young adult, I internalized this more and more. As an adult, I still can. I can get lost in darkness and desperation. I can feel unworthy or damaged or hopeless. I have my scars and insecurities, and fears that feel like they engulf me. I can be washed over with shame. But there are moments. As I said to my older child once when they struggled against their own demons, the waves of despair become less powerful and hit you less often. I've learned to face my challenges and to allow myself joy. It wasn't always an easy thing to do. I've learned that it's up to each of us to create the life we desire. We have the ability to lessen the influences around us that we don't want or don't agree with. When we can't lessen them, we have the ability to keep going despite them, even when we think we don't. I have to start with, I recently did a reading and I haven't done it in a long time. And when I read that intro, the prologue, I have to say that I have that scars and insecurities and damage of hopeless in the way that I did. So there really is hope. It really gets less. It blew my mind when I read it last time. So I am a child of the 60s, child of hippies. My parents met way too young, got pregnant way too young, got married way too young, split up. And we were living with my mom. Long story short, we were supposed to go live on a commune in California. Instead, we were living in East Orange, New Jersey at the time, and my grandmother was diagnosed with cancer. So we moved in with my grandparents. My grandmother passed, we stayed. My mom took care of the house for my grandfather. And then in 1974, my mom's friend with whom she used to hitchhike across country every year called her and said, "You have to go hear Reverend Moon speak." I went and came back and was like, "This is amazing. He is amazing. Jesus wasn't supposed to die." Nothing much happened. A couple of months later, Mooney's members convinced her to go up to Barrytown for a week, where an indoctrination center in upstate New York, and she went up for the week and came back. I went up for a week and then came back, and then went up for a week and came back, and then went up for a week and came back, and basically spent the whole summer there being brought into the church. And at some point, she brought my brother and I to Barrytown for the weekend, and I always remember driving up to the big building and walking to the gymnasium and looking around, and all the women, all the sisters are sitting on the floor on the right side of the room, and all the brothers and men were sitting on the floor on the left side of the room. And when the moments, one walked in with his interpreter and began speaking, and that was it. We were in, and he was my Messiah. And this is what it's like to have a Messiah. Oh, and Bob is my brother, Manny is my mom, and Danny is my dad. And yes, that's what we call them. We're hippies. Manny and I spent a great deal of time at church centers that summer. As a family, we were hooked. We were love bombed and wanted only to be surrounded by our brothers and sisters and live for God. Every weekend we went to Barrytown, the three of us would visit the center on East 71st Street in New York City for Sunday services, or Belvedere, the church estate in Tarrytown, New York, where Father would lecture on Sunday mornings at 6 a.m. We left Melbourne before sunrise to get the best seats. I love the early morning, warmed by the feeling of closeness to God and the heat of the engine underneath me. We were spoken in an empty garage on the Belvedere property, standing on a small stage set in the front of the room with his interpreter at his side. There was a blackboard behind him, in case Father wanted to explain his point further with illustration, or to thump it with his fist for emphasis. All chairs were true family arranged to the left of the stage. He spoke of God's love for us and of the glory and beauty that will be ours in the kingdom of heaven on earth. He warned us of the evils of the world, detailing how cunning Satan would be as he fought for our souls. He talked of the love that would develop between husbands and wives who are following him in God. He said their adoration for each other would be so great and selfless that they could and would sit next to each other on adjacent toilet seats while they used the bathroom with ease and joy. Just like the love toilet, a toilet for two parody from Saturday Night Live. The father was not kidding. He instructed us to always work harder and sacrifice more to accomplish greater and greater things for God. That became my new mantra. Work harder, sacrifice more, accomplish greater and greater things for God and true parents. As we crowd in, sitting cross-legged around their heels on the hard, cold concrete floor on the left side of the building, right in front of Father. Sisters Christian on the right. Mary, whom I'd started to call Mother since joining the church, as it wasn't right or respectful to call her by her name. We would grab spaces as far forward as we could on the sister's side. Robbie squeezed in with the brothers. My cat was tired if my legs started to go numb as I curled up on the floor, because I was with the Messiah. I was close to God. I can't begin to describe how intoxicating that feeling was, being around Father, beyond special, beyond lucky, beyond chosen, perhaps a combination of undeserving and graced, not holy, but physically within inches of holiness. Not ready to remove our shoes when we entered a room where Father was or would be, and bow to him when we came in or left. I would have done anything for Father, followed him anywhere. Father would ask me members to introduce themselves to him and to the crowd of family members. One Sunday morning, I did. I can't believe it when I think of it now. I was only 10 and incredibly shy, yet I had the guts to introduce myself to Father. Mother moved to the back of the room to be with some friends, leaving me up near the stage without her. The sisters next to me rubbed my back and tickled my feet as we waited for Father to speak. I leaned into them and their love and felt a sense of contentment that was wonderful, becoming less and less foreign. My father asked for introductions. I took a deep breath and stood and shook. I'm shaking. I'm talking to the Messiah. Of course I'm shaking. Father smiled upon seeing me, perhaps because I was young and little. I smiled back, unsure and aware of how unworthy I was to be standing in front of him. Feelings coursed through me. Gratitude that I could be blessed with knowing about the Messiah. Shame that I was so undeserving and tainted for my life before the church. And fear that I would somehow mess everything up. That I would let God down. I knew God wanted and needed more from me than I knew how to give. Through his interpreter, Father asked me my name. I'm not sure my reply was audible. How does one act around the Messiah? I was trying to figure that out. I knew I wasn't good or pure enough to talk with him. I felt and heard my voice quaver. I didn't want anything to quaver. I wanted to appear strong. I wanted to be strong. God and Father needed warriors to bring the kingdom of heaven to earth. He asked who my spiritual mother was. Your spiritual parent is the person who brought you into the church. I replied that it was my own mother. We talked for a few more minutes. I can't remember about what. And I sat down, my heart pounding as if I'd sprinted a mile or more. It was good to feel the floor beneath me. I hoped I hadn't made too much of a fool of myself, that I hadn't said anything too stupid. So what I'll try to point out to people, and maybe those of you who joined or first gen might recognize this, but by what had been going on in our lives before the church, when we joined the church, Unification Church, the church was a haven in many ways for my brother and I. It was safety, it was structure, it was better than where we came from. And so in the beginning, it was just all good. And we got more involved, and this is what happened. As if at warp speed, the church became the center of my universe, the center on which I revolved, into which I clung for warmth and light. In retrospect, maybe it was a hole in my life that the church filled. Or maybe it was a hole in mother's life or psyche, and I took it on. Whatever the reason, I was consumed. Preaching and proselytizing for Father was paramount. Those were the only people I wanted to be with. 74th Street, Belvedere, and Barrytown were the only places I wanted to be. There was no room for Danny. Whereas I barely visited him before the church, now I had no desire to see him. Even Robbie chose a church over Danny. All we cared about was our lives as Moonies. During our days at home in Melbourne, we bided time in school and with friends who had mattered to us until we could get back to what mattered to us now. Nobody especially immersed herself in this new world. At first, she was with us throughout the week and things went on as usual. Except for the fact that we now subscribe to a religion that was perceived by non-family members as bizarre. What do you believe? My friend Donna would ask me. She's Catholic. Sarah doesn't get it. That's okay. Donna would love to hear about Father being the second coming of Jesus. I mean, you have to be careful not to actually say he's the Messiah. I try and explain. What? She'd ask again? That's weird. Are you sure? Well, I was short a new affiliation, which I did as often as possible, and not just with Donna, but with everyone, since the whole idea was to bring the entire world to principle. My classmates stared at me intensely, or rolled their eyes, or told me I was crazy and strange. That's why I'm more sympathetic. They questioned the church and were afraid of Father specifically, and of Moonies in general. They are Father to Hitler, to Mussolini, and to Charles Manson. They are petrified of being brainwashed, of having their children brainwashed. They knew that everyone outside the church was living for Satan and needed to be saved. But now, with conviction and dedication, I didn't notice his mother headed into New York City a few days during the week to volunteer at 71st Street. At first, she was back in time to cook us dinner. She waited more and more, taking the first commuter train in the morning and coming home on the last train at night. We all left on our own to fix our meals, as well as to get to school and put ourselves to bed. That was fine. Mother still came home to sleep, and it was for Father and for God. She started staying over some nights, and then more. Finally, in January 1975, at a rare time when Mother was around, and about 6 months after my first trip to Barrytown, she sat us down in the same flowered wing chair in the living room. That must have been our special serious conversation chair. It was a cold winter day. I snuggled up with her. Sweetie, she began as she held us close. She paused for a long time, and I sat there, feeling for her as best I could, wondering what was next. Sweeties, I'm not sure how long I can keep this up, taking a 6 a.m. train out and not getting back till after 1. Hello, Mother, I spit out. I needed her to know I didn't question her at all. It's too hard. And I need to be there. I need to help. And I'm called to be there as much as I can. I wondered what was taking you so long to figure this out, Robbie offered. His voice so subdued, I almost couldn't hear him. Mother squeezed us tighter. What should I do? She asked. What do you two think I should do? Go, Mother. My voice couldn't have been quieter, and I realized I sounded like I didn't want her to go. I didn't want her to go. That's how sinful I was. I didn't want her to go. But I couldn't sound that way. Go, Mother, I tried again. Go to where you have to be. You're doing it for God, Robbie added. I know you're doing it for God. After that, I suppose Robbie and I promised we'd be good and assured her that we'd be okay. I imagine I would have talked about logistics and school and Pop and how we get to visit her. I don't remember. Everything was a blur. I sat on her lap, willing myself not to cry, and memorizing the feel of her next to me, the warmth of her body, her laughter, and her smile. That was God's will for her, and I wasn't going to stop her from doing what she needed to do, no matter what. I was prepared and eager to sacrifice and work for God in any way I could, even if it meant giving up my mother. So I was living outside of New York City, and she moved into New York City, ironically to help run the group that was for people who had kids and couldn't move into the church. And even more ironically, my mom spent most of her time in the church raising blessed children, those children born in the huge arranged marriages. To this day, I meet other second gens who say, oh, your mother took such good care of me when I was young. So, yeah, I was in the and everything became my responsibility, the shopping, the cooking, the cleaning. I was running the house. My brother was not doing anything. My grandfather was, unbeknownst to us, on the verge of a nervous breakdown. So he had been a judge. He was a judge and a lawyer. And when my grandmother died, he got depressed and stopped practicing the cases. And then when my mom left, he got more depressed and stopped practicing his cases. And then he was discovered. And then the police were literally circling our block on a suicide watch for him. And I had no idea of any of this. And eventually he was going to go to court and maybe to jail. And instead his doctor put him into the psychiatric ward of my local hospital. And we were pulled out of school and shuffled around for a couple of weeks with friends of my grandfather's in the area. And someone went to get my mom and asked her to come back. And she said, not my problem, and stayed in the church with the church. And eventually someone told my dad what was going on, and he came and got us and we moved in with him. It's a whole other side of my story. In New York City's East Village in the 1970s, when it was only seedy and weird, and sex, drugs, and rock and roll, that was his life. And so I was a Mooney, believing, practicing, loving, best friends with Moon's kids. It was my life, but lived with Satan with my dad Monday through Friday. So Monday through Friday, satanic lifestyle around me, and weekends, holidays, vacations, whatever, always at the church in any way, feeling never enough and all of that. That's what I'm trying. And then, long story short, one of my dear friends, I was best friends with Moon kids and also with some of the blessed children. And one of my 6-year-old friends, one of the blessed children, was seduced by a Sunday school teacher. And in order from keeping anyone from knowing, right, premarital sex, huge sin, keeping anyone from knowing, she spread rumors that I wanted to have sex with all the brothers, all the men in the church. And Moon heard these rumors, believed these rumors, and made a decree that only blessed children could be with the true children, with his children, in order to keep me, a sinful influence, away. Which is ironic because I was the purest of all of us, but that was the decree. And so I'm going into my last year of high school, and I'm, knowing that at this point I'm questioning and confused with all of this. And so I'm knowing that I'm questioning, and therefore Satan's inside me, because we were literally taught that if you ever question anything, it's Satan trying to win you back from God. And I'm also knowing that Moon, the Messiah, also knows that Satan's in me because Moon has banished me, pushed me away. So I go into my last year of high school and I think, okay, you followed your mom into this church. You were a child. Now you need to make an adult decision at the age of 17, but you need to pull back, see life on the outside a little bit more, make an adult decision to come back and never question again. And so I pull back a little bit and I start hanging out on the weekends at home and in school, and I make friends, and it's enticing and it feels more unconditional than in the church. And I get more and more confused, and I start experimenting with a little bit of alcohol, and I throw a party for my best friend and get beyond drunk. And in the midst of that, get kissed by a boy, kiss him back, therefore have a boyfriend. Biggest son, all hell breaks loose. Everybody's screaming at me, you're going to sin, you're going to fall, you're going to fall. Summer after high school is torment and torturous. My poor dear boyfriend at the time literally proposes to me to come up with an answer. I go off to school. I go up to Cornell up in upstate New York, and he stays home in New York City at NYU. And I go off to school, and I determine that I will break up with him and I will go back to God. I do know that Moon is the Messiah. I don't want to do it, but I know he's the Messiah. And so I make that determination. I make that decision. I go off to school, and I don't stick with it. I stick with my new life and my boyfriend instead. And this is what happens. At Cornell, they joke about people committing suicide by jumping off the bridges. Someone had painted jumping zones and watching zones on the suspension bridge. And all the freshmen had heard a rumor that you were guaranteed an automatic 4.0 should your roommate jump. Before a stressful exam, Annie and I would teasingly suggest the option to each other in order to win a good grade. These days, they have nets under the bridges as a deterrent and safety measure. Then came the day that option became real. I was heading back to the dorms from my job at a daycare center off campus. And I took the Stewart Avenue Bridge over Fall Creek Gorge. Halfway across the bridge that afternoon, I stopped and stood still, unable to continue. I gazed down the road toward where I was going and over the railing to the rocks below. I could hear water splashing, and if I listened for it, birds singing in the distance. I could feel the sun beating down. Frozen there, seeing but not seeing, hearing but not hearing, thoughts of plunging to the bottom of the gorge surged inside my head. I know it sounds cliche, but the minutes passed in a super slow motion, and I didn't think I could go on. Not the rest of the way across the bridge, and not with my life, after the choices I had made. Each day was taking me further and further from the church and all I had known, believed, and loved. Self-condemnation and remorse simmered inside me like a newly active volcano about to erupt. Everything hurt too much. It was way too hard. Way too hard. I stared up at the sky, tears in my eyes, desperate to reconnect with the God I'd known through much of my childhood, longing for the sense of purpose and meaning that has sustained me for so long, begging for the all-consuming doubt and anguish within me to be lifted. High places are known to fill one with an urge to jump, to experience the sensation of falling, called high place phenomenon. But my feelings that day were different. It was almost as if I was empty, with a vacant pit inside me that echoed my torment and despair. I stood there with the gorge below and contemplated the fall. How long would it take? What would it be like? It was a beautiful autumn day. The sun was shining, the leaves were turning, and the air was crisp. I was in my first year of college with my future in front of me, but I had no desire to make it to the other side of the bridge. I couldn't choose a path for the rest of my life. I couldn't. That was the easy, only, and best way out of the situation. If I was dead, I wouldn't be ashamed of falling and walking away from the Messiah and my responsibility. I wouldn't be another person who wasn't strong enough or good enough, who turned against God and killed God's heart. Then I wouldn't have to leave Adam. This would all be done. I stood on the bridge for 10 or 15 minutes, looking over the railing, studying the rocks with their jagged edges and the water calmly bubbling, thinking about the immediate release I would experience. I wanted to fall to my physical death to avoid falling, having sex outside of a blessed marriage, to my spiritual death. Eventually, I turned around and walked back to campus. Why? How? To this day, I don't know. Why did I return to my dorm and act as if nothing had happened? How did I find it in myself to do that? What got me through that moment? What got me through everything leading up to that moment, and what would hopefully get me through everything else yet to come? I have no idea. People ask me how I made it through without cracking, without succumbing, without being far too damaged. Again, I just don't know. Maybe I didn't jump to my death that day because jumping would have been admitting defeat, and I was too stubborn for that. Maybe there was a part of me that loved life and that somehow saw some possibility and hope, or some chance for peace, even with my turmoil. Maybe there was a will in me to survive. Maybe I was protected by some greater power in the universe. Maybe I do have a steel rod for a spine. Maybe I'm just lucky. I had decided not to throw myself over the bridge that day, but I still didn't know how to throw off the shackles of the church, how to lessen its influence and control of my mind and life. I didn't know how to make a final choice to leave, and I didn't know how to be anything but a Mooney. I didn't know what not being a Mooney meant. So I obviously didn't jump, and I obviously left the church. And it's a long process, and I punished myself for a long time in various ways, literally having no idea how much influence and control it had in my life. I literally didn't know that until I came to ICSA and started to look at what being raised in a cult does to your brain, to my brain. Well, I left the church, and I guess I stopped eating. Then I did a hell of a lot of cocaine. Then I got engaged to someone who, I had a bunch of bad relationships. I got engaged to someone who drank a hell of a lot, and was really mean when he drank. And luckily for me, in 1986, someone pointed me in the direction of Al-Anon, the 12-step program for those of us with our arms clasped around an alcoholic. I went to my first meeting thinking, tell him he's an alcoholic. There's no way I would ever be with an alcoholic. Only to realize, right? There's a multitude, so many reasons. There's addiction all over my family, my dad's side, and I was raised in a cult. And that started my journey of healing, of seeing, first thinking I was completely damaged and broken. And over the years, realizing that I'm not damaged. I have damage. That's how I define it. I have damage. I'm not damaged. I have scars. But every day I get a little stronger. Every day I call the cult out of my brain a little better. Every day I love myself more and have learned to, I don't even know I despise myself, and I've learned to love myself and know that the shame was given to me. All these things I've learned over the years. Yeah. So I hope that story is useful. I hope that's enough information. There's more in the book. There's more if you reach out to me. I'd love to connect with any of you. I just want to say I wish I were there to give you all real hugs. And again, you know, especially second gens, multi-gens, but for everyone, I do firmly believe and know that it is okay and it can get okay and I can be okay. Yeah. But what is this? This is perfection, but this moment is perfect and I am perfect just as I am, and it's enough. And I will stop preaching and just say thank you for the opportunity to share my story. And I hope to hear from all of you. And again, thank you, Pat, Joe, Ashlen, for inviting me. And yeah, enjoy the rest of the conference. Take care.
Lisa sent a message just a while ago about
Do you want the microphone?
the discussion we were having. And so I don't exactly know what was, as she said, she was, but she agreed with Ashlen, but she said she doesn't think that first generations of people understand how carved out our brains were when we were supposed to be developing. And if you get this, it affects her to this day. So there's another perspective.
Lisa's story is really emotional. I feel many emotions right now. I'm sure many of you do, but thank you for listening to that, for hanging in with us. I know that this is a long panel. We're going to put up a meetup on the Whova app so we can continue this discussion in like a week, so we can have some time to chill in between now and then. Thank you for being here and for sharing, and thank you for staying and listening to Lisa's story.
For all you who shared your stories with us,
Yeah.
thank you so much. And
Thank
for
you.
those who've attended, we appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you.